And we're live. Okay.
Where we are.
Hooray! Thank you.
Thank you.
We will edit the video to make it look like all of that pre-show didn't happen. So we're good on there. Live stream is good. Nikki, do you mind keeping that open just to like tell us if it goes down or something? And
That's
no, don't listen. Yeah, you don't have to listen. I just mean in case the video goes down. So yeah, hi. So this is Queer Sex Ed. This is a sex positive show where I don't have the thing in front of me. If we talk about sex and stuff, I don't know what to tell you. Like
this is a sex positive podcast where we talk about sex, relationships, and BDSM from a queer and trans lens.
Okay, yeah. That's most of it. I think.
Yeah. I think that was fine.
No, it's great. I just mean like I can't remember it, so it's good.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Sara. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I'm here with my co-host.
This is Jay, and I use these, and theirs pronouns.
So hello, hi everybody. We're live. This is our first live show we've ever done.
We are live at CU Boulder.
Yeah. So we want to thank the Ace&Aro student group for bringing us in. And if you're on the CU Boulder campus and you identify as Ace or Aro, come check out the group. We also want to, I feel like there's somebody else we should thank, but.
GSA did a little bit.
Yes, yeah, we're gonna thank the GSA for CU as well. Thank you so much for yesterday for bringing us in for our workshop as well. And yeah, that was fun too.
That was super fun.
So we're here. If there's any technical difficulties, bear with us. And let's go. So, what?
You were just obviously nervous, and it's okay.
I'm very nervous. I don't know what to tell you.
It's all good.
I haven't done live performance in so long.
Turn down.
My nervousness.
The internal critic.
It doesn't. Yeah.
It's all good.
It's fine.
Okay. Imposter syndrome. Turn on. There we go.
Oh, that's how that works.
Yes, you just turn it off. Just press the button. It's fine.
So today we're going to do a little bit of a different show, obviously. We're going to talk about our word/concept of the show. And then after that, we're going to take questions from the audience here. And then we also have some email questions in case folks don't have a question as well. So we're going to start off our show of the week. Our show of the week.
It is a show of the week.
Show this week. Our word of the week this, oh my gosh. I'm so nervous.
We're going to start off with our word of the show that's actually a word.
Which is sex.
We actually, surprisingly, in over a year, have not actually taken the time to define sex.
Yeah, no, and some of that's been like an intentional process.
Oh, totally.
In some ways, you know, of like being like, we talk about sex in a really expansive way and think about sex as something that's really broad and self-defined, and it's a thing that I think people feel like it has a really simple definition, but then when you start talking to people and say like, well, what does sex mean for you and for you and for you, you actually start to realize that each person has a really individual definition and understanding of what sex is. And that makes sense, right? Because all of our sex lives are also individual. All of our desires are individual. And so one of the things we wanted to start by talking about is why is it so hard to define sex?
Yeah.
One of the things we want.
The live stream is working. Yeah, so part of this is it's a really slippery word.
Okay.
So it's a really slippery word, pun unintended, when talking about sex, although lube makes everything better. So just reminding people, more lube, better sex.
Always more lube.
Great. I mean, not always, then you reduce the friction to a point that it's kind of ridiculous, but that's okay.
If there's zero lube,
then it's a problem. Always more lube. And often if there's lube, still more lube. Anyway. So when we start thinking about like, how do you define sex, then all of these different kind of concepts come up. And so there's this way of kind of overcomplicating it while trying to simplify it that gets really, really irritating. So is penetration required for sex to occur? And what kind of penetration? and with what, and in where, and with whom? Is orgasm required for sex to occur? Are genitals required for sex to occur? Do you need at least 2 people for sex to occur? Do you need to have love, affection, or some sort of positive feeling for the other folks involved if sex is occurring? And for any one of these, some people are going to say yes, some people are going to say no. I often come down on the no side on a lot of this. But there's this sense of wanting to get to kind of what is a universal, real definition, so that then we all know what we're talking about when we say it. But if we just ask the folks in the room, you know, does sex require orgasm? Raise your hand if yes. Not a single person in this room raised their hand. And I'm sure there's people listening to it go, well, that is the goal. Even if it doesn't happen, you're supposed to be focused on that, right? But then if you're focused on orgasm, is kink not sex?
Right.
That is having intimate contact with someone whose body doesn't orgasm that time, not sex, in some other way. So it just gets this really hard to define. And part of this is, again, trying to get to this easy piece. But a lot of times when we're really talking about this, it comes back down to power.
Yeah, definitely. Was there something else you wanted to say about power?
I mean, there's a lot more that I want to say about power, and I'm trying to give you space to talk too, because I just went on a monologue.
That's fine. I'm nervous. Okay. These are all the parts that I get to edit out when I'm editing, so now I have to just be here. So I think part of what makes sex so hard to define is also the media environment that we exist in, right? Because we both, sex is everywhere, right? It's in our advertising, it's in our movies, it's in the books that we're reading, it's in our pop culture, it's what people are talking about on the news. Like, it's something that's everywhere around us all the time, but also that we're not supposed to talk about, and that's obscured or hidden or put behind these like euphemistic words like making love or whatever, right? And so it's
a phrase I personally hate it so much. Other people love it, or it defines a really specific thing for them, and that is wonderful. If I have a partner that says that, I'm just like, and I'm no longer interested. Sorry.
You know, but when we're talking about sex, it's in this environment where we're both seeing it all the time and we're thinking about it all the time, but it's also obscured from us and hidden from us and not taught. And so having this sort of nebulous definition of like, well, I guess it has to be penetration, and I guess it has to include certain fluids or orgasm or certain types of sex acts, or whatever, and it has to build up to penetration, or like all of these ideas come from places of power. It comes from straightness. It comes from cisgender like expectations about bodies. It comes from a world that assumes that sex is primarily for procreation and making children, right? And so when you have all those assumptions, you're not leaving people the option to define what their own understanding of sex is, and you're instead comparing it against this template and saying like, well, that what you're doing for kink isn't real sex, or because you don't have sex with that body part as a trans woman, you're not having real sex, or because whatever else. And so it becomes hard to define, but it also becomes something that people define in ways that have power, right? The way that we define sex has power to it, and what we think of as sex and dismiss as not sex has a lot of power to it, right? Especially like, for example, like gay women's relationships. Like there's a lot of lesbian relationships or bi women who are in relationships with other women who are made completely invisible because our world doesn't see the type of sex that those bodies are having as real sex, right? Or straight men that are having sex with a trans woman, like we don't see that as straight sex because we don't let those people define that relationship themselves. We see it through our outside lens of, well, he's just a gay guy who's like afraid to come out, or that type of thing.
Right, so we end up then with the kind of normative idea of what real sex is, right? Which is going to be penis in vagina penetration with the goal of the holder of said penis having an orgasm. Because it's really not focused on the person who is being penetrated, receiving any sort of pleasure or orgasm from that. It's really focused on the person, particularly a cis man, having an orgasm and pleasure from this experience. Some of the saddest things that I hear from like straight cis women in particular is, oh yeah, before I started having real sex, I loved fingering, but I don't do that anymore because now I have the real thing. And I'm like, but you could still do the other thing too. Like that's great. And if fingering it, and there was one friend in particular who was like, oh yeah, no, I always can come that way, but we just don't do it anymore because we have real sex. And I was like, Sweetheart, you're 30. You get to define sex however you want to.
Yeah.
And if your partner is not willing to do that, then maybe you need to be talking about this. So once you've defined what real and normal sex is, then you get to define what everything else is as abnormal, unhealthy, immoral, and not real. And so then you can push it further and further to the margins. And a lot of the marginalization that comes from heterosexism and cissexism can be found at its root in sexuality in some ways, or where it expresses in sexuality. And then we also see how this restriction and oppression and bias gets built into racism, to sexism, to misogyny in really, really, really toxic ways that further limits what sex is supposed to look like.
Yeah, totally. And I think another outcome of this too is the idea that other activities exist to be foreplay for real sex, or to get you to the place where you want to have real sex. Again, that definition of real sex meaning like penetration by a cis man focused on his orgasm, right? Or sometimes like other things that look similar to that, right? Like a cis woman wearing a strap on and penetrating another partner that way, right? Something like that. But when you have that type of definition, you also then see things as like kink or kissing or spanking or like these other activities. They just become like foreplay or things that lead up to our idea of real sex and like don't get seen as entire activities by themselves, right? That's one thing for me as a person who's demisexual and who sort of goes in and out of feeling sexual desire. It was a big process for me to reclaim like, oh, I can cuddle and that's sex. Like I can have really deep, intimate cuddling session with somebody where I feel really connected with them and it feels really powerful and it feels like this thing that's really important to me. And that is sex. Like that's how I define my sex for me, right? Or I can make out with somebody and have a really intimate kissing session that feels complete. Like it feels like that in and of itself is a complete experience. And I think when we look at this idea of real sex or a certain type of sex being seen as more important than other types, what we miss out on is like how great it could be to have a 2-hour makeout session, or how much fun it can be to just like cuddle with a big group of people together, right? Or these other activities that get kind of, again, pushed to the margins, pushed to the side, or made to seem like they're deviant or wrong, right? That's one of the ways that kink is really pushed out of mainstream circles, right? Is by saying like, well, there's something wrong with this, and then there's something wrong with you if you want to do this as well. Right?
And then we define it out of sexuality education, and so then people struggle to find information about it, struggle to find good resources, struggle to find skills building, struggle to find other people to connect with, and we have 11-year-olds who are seeing really hardcore kink porn who have no idea what this is, and it just looks like violence.
Yeah.
And admittedly, a lot of hardcore porn is pretty crappy and often fairly violent and pretty exploitative, but that's a different episode.
And some of this like factors into that as well, right? Of like the way that we portray, again, porn is fantasy, right? It's not sex education. It's not supposed to be sex education. But one of the outcomes of that fantasy being the only way that people learn about sex is that kink doesn't, the porn usually doesn't include things like communicating about your safe word, or talking about what boundaries you're going to use, or talking about if you're going to use barriers or not,
right.
Or switching between different activities, or getting more lube to put it on, or like all these things that happen in like actual sex when people are having it don't happen in porn. And so if that's the only exposure people have to sexuality, then we get in weird places where people think like that lube means you're bad at sex if you have to use it, or that like if you have to talk about safe words, it's because you're a wimp and who cares and let's just play, or like these types of things that are really problematic come from this framing of sex as a really specific thing, and also push things outside of that definition to make them feel scary, wrong, dangerous. What's wrong with you as a person if you like these things, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and they also lead to kind of these weird definitions of other things. Like virginity as a thing is the weirdest shit to me.
Yeah.
And admittedly, like it's been defined in many, many ways throughout history. Like it was before marriage, or before having a child, or that you were a virgin or a maiden, and then that you were, a different level of womanhood, whatever. But this idea of virginity is when you have had sex for the first time, which, what does that mean? And then there's this idea that, if you've never had a flesh penis inside your body, or you have never put your flesh penis inside someone else's body, that you're still a virgin. And so I hear in LGBT and queer communities, people talking about like, oh, well, you've never had real sex, you're still a virgin. And I'm like, they were just talking about fisting.
Okay.
Tell me again why this is centered on your cis penis.
Right. Because again, it comes back to power, right? It's the idea that cis men get to define what sex is, and the idea that like a receptive person's body is fundamentally changed by having a cis man's penis inside of it is ridiculous to me. Like nothing about your body changes after you have that type of sexual experience, especially not over other things, right? Like in my life, I used to say like, well, the first time I had sex was when I was 17, and it's because it was the first time I had like penetrative sex where I had an orgasm, right? But now when I look back, I'm like, oh, actually, like that was sex, and that was sex, and that was sex, and actually, I was a lot younger than I thought I was because I had all these experiences that were fingering or that were making out or that were like things that I wouldn't have defined as sex at the time. But looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, like we were totally exploring sex. We just didn't want to have penetrative sex because she was a Catholic or because, you know, whatever other reasons. Mostly the Catholic stuff.
Oh.
It's hard when we can't highlight the notes to see where we've been.
I'm checking marking
checking.
things.
Okay, cool,
It's
cool.
good. Yes.
Okay.
So how this also then shows up, there's these kind of horizontal oppression that shows up within queer and trans community, particularly often perpetuated by cis folks in excluding trans people. But you hear things like gold star lesbian or gold star gay, meaning that you've never had sex with a woman or a man. My least favorite is platinum star gay, meaning that you were born via cesarean section, and so there was no vagina near you at any time. And I was like,
yeah, gay men are a parody of themselves.
Like, we don't need drag shows anymore. Just listen to somebody talk about being a platinum star gay, and that's the most parody that we ever need ever. Like, I'm just like, what the fuck is wrong with you? Someone close to me recently started talking about this, which then turned into an hour of me going, so tell me more about how that's not transphobic. And just ended with, okay, I'm sorry. I won't say it again. I was like, good. Some of the other pieces around sex, though, that do come up is then it gets right enshrined into policy. So, for example, for a long time, a marriage was not considered legal until it was consummated. Mm-hmm. And consummation meant penis was put into vagina. Yeah. And so this was actually the justification that Henry VIII used for his first wife, Mary, was, oh, it was never consummated. It was. But they were real happy to just go, sure, we'll annul that. You can marry this other person who you'll later behead. But then it also gets, and I will put, that we're gonna talk a little bit about kind of legal definition-y stuff here, which ends up touching on some things that may be uncomfortable for folks. But right, so we get legal definitions of what marriage is, we get legal definitions of who is then responsible for a child, comes back down to a sexual contact and an insemination versus who has raised a child. And we also get things around how sexual assault is defined. Mm-hmm. And in certain states, they're like Wisconsin, where I live, there's like this really detailed definition of what all of that means. But sometimes it's just like, when you have forced sexual contact, what does that mean?
Right. And oftentimes it means like what we've been talking about. It's just that it's not well defined. And then what ends up happening, just like we talked about on the queer criminalization episode, is that any type of law or statute like that that's vague is always going to be disproportionately focused on people of color and queer people, right? And so when you have disproportionate impacts of that, it usually comes from these really vague definitions of sex or what's wrong or what's allowed or not allowed.
Yeah. So Sara.
Yeah.
What's your definition of sex?
You would have thought I thought about this before we came into about it, but I did not. Can I use the pornography definition like I know it when I'm having it?
You really want to rely on that shitty Supreme Court justice.
I know.
For your definition of sex.
No, I don't. I think for me, sex, being demisexual means that I kind of go in and out of wanting like penetrative sex and specific types of sexuality. And so I think for me, I've really expanded my definition of sex to be really, really broad. And it's less about the activities that I'm doing, and it's more about the feelings that's going along with those activities, or the people that I'm with, and the trust that I'm having, and the like those pieces of it are a lot more of what makes it sex for me. And so it can mean things like making out is sex for me, or cuddling is sex for me, or other things can be sexual for me. And it's one thing that was really hard. Now I'm not dating on sort of OkCupid or Tinder as much, but when I was, and going on a lot of sort of like first and second dates with people who were sort of more mainstream circles of sexuality and queerness, there was kind of this weird mismatch where like I would feel like what we were doing was pretty intimate and sexual in my definition of it, but I also didn't want to define it as that, because it might like squick other people out to be like, you mean that cuddling was sex? Like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, and so it's a thing where for me, I see a lot of those as my own understanding of sex for myself, especially like incorporating kink into sex. Like there are definitely a lot of times where my nesting partner and I have a pretty ownership-y dom-sub type relationship. And there are a lot of days where we don't have penetrative sex or orgasm, but we just tease a lot, or we're just playing a lot, or I'm like trying to not look at her as I'm talking about it. She's in the audience.
You can look at me while you're talking about it.
Polyamory. But sort of being in this place of really validating that it's okay if we don't have a certain type of sex, and it doesn't make me broken, it doesn't make me a worse partner, it doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. And so that's sort of where I've landed, is really expanded it to include kink, other intimate activities, even sometimes a really deep conversation feels like brain sex for me. Where that type of conversation, we're just talking for hours longer than you meant to. Like a lot of our early phone conversations, like felt sexual for me.
A lot of them weren't very sexual.
Well, okay, there's also that going on too. Yeah. What about for you? What's your definition of sex?
So the definition that I kind of broadly use is kind of negotiated, consensual, physical intimacy, in person or mediated via technology.
Wow, that's a way better definition than mine.
Not that cyber sex does anything for me.
Oh, it's so good. I love it.
I am happy to do it with people who are super excited about it.
I think it's my camming history.
Yeah,
it reminds me. It's like camming, but just for one person who can't call me like bad slurs. So it's great.
or if they do, you turn off the channel and never speak to them again because they're a shit human.
Exactly. Yeah. Hopefully, like it's not somebody I'm dating.
Yeah, and sometimes I define between like sex and fucking, because fucking for me is definitely focused on penetration or orgasm.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't require penetration. Like if I am playing with my nesting partner's cock and making them come, they're a highly orgasmic person, 80 times. Not
kidding, not exaggerating.
Not exaggerating. We've hit over 300 in a couple of days. That is, and then there's no penetration involved. Like that is absolutely fucking to me. Oral is fucking to me. Having anything kind of put inside of an orifice for me is usually fucking. Sometimes it's exploration or in the direction of certain kinds of kink, like electroplay, which we will have an episode about in the next couple weeks here.
It's true.
So I kind of make that definition, that distinction between sex and fucking, because sex is a huge broad piece and fucking is a small part of it for me. And if you're at an orgy with other people, you are participating in that. You are all having sex together, even if you don't have contact with those other people. So but again, it's really kind of negotiated, consensual physical intimacy is really the piece for me, that it's not like, we haven't talked about what my definition of sex is, and then we have a conversation and we're making out, and I'm thinking, okay, we had sex, and you're like, that's not anything like sex to me at all. We need to have that conversation to make sure we're kind of on the same page. But there's also this like push for this universal definition that's really frustrating to me because it's just unnecessary. And frankly, it's often used in this kind of like, oh, well, I'm so much more sex positive than you because I do all these other things, or I've had all these sex partners or whatever else. And it's just unnecessary to compete in those ways, or to be able to have kind of this definition to say, well, my sex is real, but your sex isn't real.
Yeah, that's a big part of it too. Yeah, I think that, and you see that happen in like identity communities too, around like trans identities or the queer identities or stuff, where it's like the power of definition is a really important power,
Yes.
right? And being able to self-define is really empowering, and being able to find identities that fit for you is really empowering. But sometimes that power can get twisted and turned on other people, where it's like, well, I'm, as a binary trans woman, for example, am valid, and there's all this science upholding me, but all these non-binary people are invalid because there's no support for, you know, whatever. And so it's like that way, that's not what I believe. I want to be super clear.
Well, we also have a nature and nurture episode that people can go listen to, where we basically just rail on about how shitty the science is, and why is this fucking necessary anyway.
But sort of this way that people push up their own identity or their own idea of sex or their own sort of experiences by pushing down other ones and saying like, I'm more real because I can prove that these other things are less real or less valid or whatever else.
And it really just comes down to, it doesn't matter how many people you've had sex with or certain kinds of sex with. It doesn't matter how many times. It doesn't matter how often, what kinds, what you're doing. If it's consensual, if it's negotiated, if it feels good for everybody involved, or if you're just masturbating and that's amazing because that's sex too, great. And we don't have to aim for this universal thing that we can all agree on, because we can always define our terms before we have a conversation. And we should just be doing that anyway.
Yeah, totally. One thing that you mentioned that I'm thinking about as well is the masturbation piece. So like, that was another sort of really important step for me, was before I sort of started thinking really critically about sex and what do I define as sex, I didn't count masturbation as sex. I counted it as like this thing that I had to do to meet some sort of physical need, but that was like that it was basically like failed sex, right? It was like I could have gone out and had real sex, quote unquote, with like another person, but instead I failed on that, and so now I am here at home masturbating, right? And I think that framing of masturbation is really popular and really common. It shows up in like media tropes a lot, and you know, like
also like the men's rights activist,
like incel-y stuff
bullshit,
and whatever,
like it shows up really strongly there.
You know, just like joking about a lonely dude with a box of tissues, like all that kind of crap, you know, like all that kind of fits in that same box. And for me, it was really powerful to reclaim, like, no, this is like sex. Like, I'm fucking myself. Like, I am my favorite partner, and I know my body, and I like how I can use my body in different ways. And, you know, being able to reclaim that also helped me then find other sexual partners too, because I wasn't coming from this place of scarcity or fear, or I was basically like, well, I'm gonna have fun fucking myself anyway. So if you want to be invited, you're welcome. But like, it's already gonna be fun for me, right? And so having that mindset was really powerful for me, to reclaim that as like, no, this is valid and powerful, and this is a part of me and my body and exploring myself, and this is sex also.
Yeah, and it's okay also if you are not your favorite partner. I am not my favorite partner, partly because of, you know, physical disability restrictions. Like, I can't fuck myself the way that I would like to because my body just doesn't let me. So I have other favorite partners, but I'm still gonna have a good time by myself, even though often masturbation is more of a maintenance thing for me. Yeah, it just doesn't do a whole lot for me, and that's fine. It doesn't have to. But like, but I am definitely my most efficient partner.
Maybe that's what I mean. Yeah, maybe I mean most efficient.
I will get to orgasm real fast with me.
That's funny.
Anything else you want to say about defining sex?
No, I think that's pretty. I think that covers it pretty well.
So I think we're going to move on to questions, and we're going to start with one of the questions we got via email.
But if someone could collect, so that we could ask those other questions.
That'd be super great.
Okay. Yeah. So our first question is about STIs, and we got a question that asked, when I go to the doctor and I ask for a full STI screening, they only test for gonorrhea, syphilis, chlamydia, and HIV. But there's so many others to get tested for, I think. What do you recommend getting regularly tested for?
Yeah.
This is a really common question that a lot of people have.
It's a really good one.
And part of it is a problem of naming, of just calling it comprehensive,
right,
is an issue as well. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah. So the first thing that just kind of comes up for me is this like kind of idea of like, how do you recommend getting regularly tested for? And really regular testing is at least yearly for everybody. And beyond that, it really kind of comes down to what you're doing. So if you're having, if you have a unprotected sex with somebody, so if you don't use barriers in some way, it's a good idea to get tested after that. But you're gonna wanna wait a little while because things don't show up immediately. So if you're like freaking out and you go 2 hours later, nothing is gonna show up on that. You gotta give it some time. And I will say, with the exception of if you have sex with someone who you know is HIV positive, or you find out is HIV positive and are not on PrEP, not using barriers, or a barrier breaks, and they may or may not have a high viral load, it's just a good idea. You can actually go in and ask for what's called a PSR test, and they'll actually go in and test virus, and that can catch it within the first couple of weeks, which means that you can get into treatment really quickly. It's just you have to have kind of this like quote unquote what public health would call a high risk contact, because if you don't, I'm sorry, it's a PCR test, not PSR test. Because if you don't, they won't do that because it's an expensive test. It's I believe usually between around $600 to $1,200. Which you won't have to pay for. Public health will pay for. Thanks, public health. Or your health insurance. Thanks, health insurance. But they won't do the PCR unless you're kind of have this high risk, risk contact. Other than that, though, like if you have partners who you are using barriers with sometimes and not others, or some partners that you are fluid bonded to, and they're also having sex with other people, about every 3 months, every 3 to 6 months is a pretty good amount. For some people, it should be more often than that, depending on how high risk your population is for like HIV, for example. Although honestly, for gonorrhea and chlamydia, just please go get tested.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. And it's real easy to get rid of.
You just have to know you have it.
And it can cause some complications. And 80% of people who are infected with gonorrhea or chlamydia have 0 symptoms. So you're just not going to know. So just go in every 3 to 6 months if you're having sexual contact with either with one person who has other partners or with several other people, and particularly if you're not using barriers. But honestly, like if you're using barriers, the likelihood that you're going to get infected with one of those is close to 0.
Yeah, the only thing with barriers you have to be aware of is skin-to-skin stuff. So if somebody's got like a herpes sore that would be outside of where a condom, an internal or external condom will cover, or where a dental dam will cover, or if somebody's got HPV and they have genital warts in an area that could touch skin to skin or something like that, you can still have contact with that outside of a condom, but any fluid-based stuff is going to be contained by that unless you have a braid.
Yeah. And with gonorrhea, chlamydia, because they're actually all, well, with the exception of syphilis, the 4 that are most commonly tested for gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, and HIV, 3 of those are fluid transmitted. So syphilis would be the only one that isn't, but syphilis is only infectious if somebody has an open sore called a chancre to begin with. So the reason that they test most regularly for these 4 is because they're just the most common. They're the ones that people are most likely to have. They're also reportable to public health. So public health actually has to step in and like try to take care of any potential for an outbreak. They will cover treatment for you. They will help you contact partners. It's really fucking great. And for other things, you just can't test regularly for them if you don't have symptoms, with the exception of trich. And if you have not had a vaccine for hepatitis A, hepatitis B, they can test you for that as well. And honestly, if you haven't had that vaccine, just go get that vaccine. It's easy. Your insurance will cover it. Student health will cover it. Public health will cover it. It's 3 shots. It's going to be real simple. And then you're protected from hepatitis A and hepatitis B, which one of those is fecal matter, A, one of those is sexual fluids, B.
The other thing too is the HPV vaccine, Gardasil, or the whatever generic term for it is, has been expanded. So
to 40?
To 40, I think. 40 for both assigned sexes. And so that was a big problem for a while, because the first trial that they did was like cis women up to 26. And so you could only get it covered for insurance. And then it created this false idea that it only worked for people who were cis women before 26. Which was a big problem with the marketing.
There was also specifically a push, like there was a decision made to only protect people with cervixes.
Yeah.
Which was fucking ridiculous because everybody should just get this vaccine.
Right. But that's like a really sexist divide that happens a lot in sex health, where like the people, you know, cis women and people with vulvas and vaginas and cervixes are the ones who are like usually have to have the preventative birth control measures, who have to be on birth control, who have to bring the condom, who have to negotiate it, you know, whatever. And so I think within the like realm of how sex medicine works, like that's, of course it's what they would think, right? Because it's just the way that those systems work.
Yeah. So as far as regular testing though, get tested chlamydia, gonorrhea, syphilis, HIV. If you have a cervix, you can get tested for HPV and should be getting that test. Usually now they've changed the guidelines again, so it's every 3 to 5 years to get a pap smear to check for HPV. So still get an exam to make sure your body's doing good. And if you don't have a cervix, you can't get tested for HPV right now. There's just no way to do it. And that's for the cancer-causing HPV, for the wart-causing HPV. If you have something that know what your body looks like, right? Know what it looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like. And if something looks, smells, or feels weird, get it checked out. Because it could be an ingrown hair, or it could be a herpes sore, or it could be the beginning of a syphilis chancre, or it could be an HPV wart. Or it could just be like molluscum, which is a sexually transmitted infection, but that nobody really talks about it because it doesn't really do anything. Just like hangs out for a little while and then goes away. Yeah. And then with herpes, also, if you're having it, again, it's only when you have an outbreak that you can really get tested for it and know if you got it. So you can absolutely go in and just like go test me for everything you can possibly test me for. They will do that, but it's just unlikely that you need testing for a lot of the things.
Yeah. The only time I recommend doing that kind of thing is like to set a baseline if you've like never been tested before or never been tested for certain things before. It's a good idea to get that full panel once at least.
Except for the blood test for herpes.
Except, yeah, the blood test for herpes is ridiculous. It's like may as well not exist because the false positive rate is so high because most people have come in contact with herpes even if they don't have herpes or show herpes symptoms. Most people have kissed someone who had a cold sore at some point or have been exposed
or their
to it.
auntie gave them a kiss when they were an infant and they then had an immune response to the herpes, but then they don't have it in their body.
Right.
And so like 90% of us will come back positive for having been exposed to herpes. And then people will freak out. But again, if you never had an outbreak, you don't really need to worry about it.
Yeah, totally.
Do you want me to go?
Yeah. Oh, we can. I was going to start with this one. If you want to look at the other ones while I'm kind of talking about this, because this one's kind of more of a me question.
Yeah, I can't answer that question. It's fine.
So the first question that we have from the audience is, what's the background of the "pleasure is a basic human right" tagline, which shows up on the album art and then it's also on the website as well. Really, for me, this kind of came out of thinking about sex and sexuality and about transness and queerness and this sort of space where I felt really crunched around. I wasn't able to show up in queer spaces because I was too kinky and polyamorous, and I wasn't able to show up in kink spaces because I was transgender, and I wasn't able to show up in, you know, just like all of these different spaces. I never felt like I fully fit in, and it felt like my sexuality wasn't seen as valuable, it wasn't seen as important, and it wasn't seen as a right. It was seen as a privilege that people can access. And I think that's how we think about sexuality a lot, is we think about sex, especially like safe sex or sex where you can make choices or define your own sexuality or all of that. We see that as a privilege, right? We see it as white dudes who go to Burning Man and pay thousands of dollars to go have a threesome, right, or whatever. But like if you're having a threesome in your bed because you have two partners, all of a sudden, like that's some sort of radical, bizarre sort of thing, right?
Also, can we just say like how unradical it is to buy that much into capitalism that the only way that you're going to potentially have a threesome is to spend thousands of dollars to go to a big weird camping thing, which like, hey, nothing against big weird camping things. Like do what you want to do. Nothing against threesomes, but like there's no.
Right. Well, and because we live in this mentality of feeling like these things aren't accessible, right? Like that normal people can't just go have a threesome, or can't just learn how to tie up their partner, or can't just like spank because it feels good sometimes, or like that we can't sort of live our lives as an accountant or an educator or a nonprofit employee or whatever, and also have fully embodied queer sex in your life. And so the sort of pleasure is a basic human right that came from this framing of sex ed the framing that we have of sex ed is very focused on skills and on memorization and on
or just abstinence.
Or abstinence, yeah, right. But we don't have a framework that really centers pleasure as a right of like, you deserve to feel pleasurable in your body. Like you deserve to feel good about what your body gets called. You deserve to be with partners who make you feel sexy and empowered, not who make you feel like you owe them something, right? And so that idea of that pleasure is a human right, I think really came out of wanting to put together these different disparate ideas of like, what would it really look like if we lived in a liberated world? Like if we were truly accessing our full sexuality and our full gender and our full selves all the time, what would that world even look like? Like we don't know. We can't know because we're so far away from it. And so that's kind of where that tagline came from.
Yeah. It was a really fun conversation when you were creating that, to have that conversation with you. All right, question from the audience. So what is the difference between monogamy, polyamory, and everything in between? That's a basic and huge question.
Yeah, it's like both like very simple and really big.
Yeah.
I kind of talked a lot. Do you want to jump
Sure,
in?
yeah. Okay. So I know that we've spent some time defining polyamory in some other episodes too, so I encourage folks to go back and listen to those. So what ends up getting often confusing for folks is kind of defining between kind of polyamory and non-monogamy. So non-monogamy is really about multiple sexual partners, and polyamory is about multiple love, which may or may not include sex, just like non-monogamy may or may not include sex. Non-monogamy can be done in super, super ethical ways and super, super unethical ways, just like polyamory can be done in super ethical or super unethical ways. And sometimes what people project into non-monogamy is a lot more rules that are created in polyamory, and a lot of rules by a lot of people who are polyam. Yeah. Jesus Christ. You can't fall in love with anyone else. I'm not sure how you're going to control that. Whereas non-monogamy is often more like, we can have multiple sexual partners, but we're just not looking to create additional relationships beyond sex. And that if it starts to grow in that way, then that's kind of outside of our agreement. So we're going to either have to refix our agreement, or we're going to have to end something with a partner or redefine what that is with this other person. Polyamory, again, there's usually some amount of boundaries of an agreement between people about what that looks like. Some folks are solo polyam, like Sarah. Hi. And we still don't really encourage people, even if they started as a couple or we're starting to open up a relationship and exploring polyamory, to still come up with their own definitions and their own kind of expectations for themselves, their own boundaries for themselves, and then talk to other people about what their boundaries are and see if your boundaries can line up and if you can come to an agreement, because otherwise it just ends up being projected rules. Yeah.
I think for me, there's a big pressure, kind of like we're talking about the sex definition too. There's a big pressure, I think, to have a definition first and then do actions based on that definition. And I like to reverse the order of those. Yeah. I like to look at, what do I want to do? What do I feel like? What am I interested in? Who am I falling in love with? And how is that love happening? And then after I am sort of assessing the feelings and my wants and my desires and whatever else, then I might sort of come to a term that makes sense. And sometimes that term is more fitting. Nikki and I call each other girlfriends because we're girlfriends, and that's a good term for us, right? But Jay and I are co-sluts because that fits our relationship better. Like I celebrate Jay's sluttiness and Z celebrates my sluttiness, and we co-slut together, and we're both great, adorable unicorns, and it fits great for us, right? And so it's less about the word itself, and it's more about finding, what do you want? What do other people want? And how do you make those meet? Everything might not line up for you. And so when it doesn't line up, it's a matter of finding what can I do that's going to fit for this? And what can you do that's going to fit for this? And if there are places where those can't reconcile, then maybe the structures need to change. Yeah. But it might also be, you can have a desire. We talked about this last night at the training. It's okay to feel a desire and put it on the back burner for a little while and be like, I'm feeling this desire to explore feet, or I'm feeling this desire to explore polyamory, or I'm feeling this desire to explore, certain types of sex or whatever. And I don't know what that means for me. And so just because you've noticed wow, I'm actually falling in love with multiple people, even though I'm monogamous and married or whatever, that you can just kind of hold that for a minute and be like, what does that mean for me? What would I want? What does it look like, right? And I think the other thing too is trusting that if you've been in a relationship with somebody and you've established something that's really strong, that strength can help carry you through changes and can help carry you through growth and through discomfort, right? Because true, like, powerful relationships are ones that work through discomfort, not ones that are always conflict-based or always fighting, but ones where when you have those disagreements or you have those misinterpretations of each other's desires or boundaries or whatever, you can learn from that and grow together. And maybe it is uncomfortable at first, but in relationships that are good for you, it's always going to bring you back to a stronger place when you feel resolved after.
Yeah, and the other part of this that I think we often do not talk a lot about, because neither of us is monogamous, is monogamy, which can be done in super ethical or super unethical ways. And a lot of the kind of the unethical monogamy often happens because it's the default.
Right.
And so people haven't thought through what they want, haven't thought through what this looks like, haven't thought through or even considered what are their desires or what their relationship structure, what that looks like, what their boundaries are even within a relationship. And if you only want to have sex with one person, or you only want to have a intimate emotional connection with one person, that's fine. That person cannot possibly meet all of your needs forever, and that's okay, and it should be, because we should be able to have other relationships, other friendships, other connections, other support, colleagues, family, friends, whatever that looks like. And so again, monogamy can be done in this super, super ethical way. It's just, again, still about what are my boundaries, what are our agreements, what are we all connecting around, rather than, oh, this is what we're supposed to do, and this is the default, and this is what everybody does. Because then what we end up with is default monogamy, is that it kind of moves into monogamy-ish, where it's basically like non-monogamous, but no one's saying anything. So we have this like cheating happening then within the structure of the relationship, because people are violating the agreements that they've come to, because they were like, oh, this isn't working for me anymore.
Right. And when you treat something as solid and permanent as like people treat monogamy sometimes, then you have to find ways to meet your needs around that thing that feels permanent and forever, right? And so the way that you get cheating, or that you get lying, or that you get like, you know, like dumping somebody and immediately starting a relationship with someone because you were already sort of cheating with them anyway, and you know, that type of thing, the way you get that isn't that monogamy is always bad, or there's something wrong with monogamy, or that like monogamy is being destabilized and ruined, or you know, whatever. It's like, no, but a lot of people who aren't monogamous were probably pushed into monogamous relationships.
Yeah.
Or a lot of people who might be like monogamish, you know, where like most of the time they want to just like have one partner that they like watch Netflix with in their pajamas, but every now and then maybe they want to go to the dungeon and get spanked or something, right? And so like there are different shades within that don't have to just be this binary choice of either like dating and fucking multiple people at once, or only having one person in your life as your romantic and sexual partner. There's sort of ways to do, you know, I know a lot of like monogamous marriages, for example, where the couple has penetrative naked genital sex as their like thing that they keep together, but then they do kink with other people, or they might have really intimate friendships where they cuddle and kiss their friends, but they don't have contact that's beyond that, or you know, whatever else. And so there's no right or wrong structure or like perfect definition for these things. There's just your structure and what works for you. And you might not know yet, and it's okay to not know also.
Yeah. Next question. Good question.
Yeah, these are great. Okay, so this question is, I know you met, meaning Jay and I know you met at a desire mapping institute at Creating Change. That is true.
Sure did. It was a long fucking day.
It was, yeah. It was a long day, and then we had dinner, and then we fucked until like 3 in the morning.
After we went to the opening plenary.
Yep, and then the next night,
where there was a protest,
we also fucked until 3 in the morning. And then the night after that, we fucked till 3 in the morning too. And
then she went to all the early morning sessions.
Oh.
And I'm just that like, way. I am too old for this shit.
I'm that way. You can ask Nikki. There are nights where I'm up until 2 or 3, but then I'm still up at 9 because it's just how my body works.
Yeah, I mean, I was up, but I sure as hell wasn't going to be around people at 8:30 in the morning.
I was. Anyway, can you talk some about what that workshop is like? what happens, what the atmosphere is like, etc. It's one of the day-long institutes I'm considering, assuming this person is going to create change probably. But I want to know what I'm getting into as asexual and kinky before I register. So that's a really great question because I'm also asexual and also kinky and wasn't sure. You know, I think for me when I went to that Desire Mapping Institute, my goal was really, I mean, it was this, right? Like I wanted to be having a podcast. I wanted to be talking about sex. I wanted to be incorporating sex into my life. And I always knew it was something I was interested in talking more about and in doing more with. But I didn't quite know how to get there. And so I think what the Desire Mapping Institute does, it's really great at fitting each individual person in a way that, because it's very self-driven. So it's not like, think about a time that you fingered somebody. Now think about it, right? It doesn't make assumptions about what is sexual for you or what activities are sexual for you. And I actually, a lot of the conversation we had in the beginning is informed by Jamie and sort of Jamie Grant's writing, at least for me, around this stuff.
And the facilitator we had was great, Jamie Grant. There's been some, I don't remember if it's going to be happening at this next Creating Change, but there was a,
it should be, I think.
Well, no, there was a cutie pox centered desire mapping, but was open for everyone, but cutie pox centered that was facilitated by, among other people, Ignacio Rivera.
Yeah, Ignacio, and I think Ashley Shackleton.
Yeah. And so, you know, you may have different facilitators, but it is very, the structure is based on a lot on Jamie's writing.
But anyway, sort of this idea of what is sex, because it was the first activity that really made me think about not what do I think I should be doing, what do I feel like needs to happen in my life, what's gonna be, but it was what do I actually want? And nobody had really asked me that question before. Like nobody had really said, like what do you actually like? Because a lot of it was just put through other people's lenses. And as somebody who has less sexual desire than my partners usually, I tend to be driven by their desires more than my own. And so if I have a partner who's really into anal sex, I end up having a lot of anal sex. And it's not that I don't like it or that I don't want to be doing it, but it's just like my desires are less strong. And so I would get pulled into different types of sex by the people I was with. And so it was the first time to really sit there and be like, what do I want? What do I like? And what does that mean for me as Demi? What does that mean for me as kinky? What does that mean for me wanting to be a dominatrix? Like all of these different pieces. And I thought it was really powerful. I would highly recommend it for people who haven't gone to one before.
Yeah, and I can't speak to it obviously someone who's specifically for someone who's asexual, because I'm not. I'm not. And there's a lot of different kinds of activities that are done in lots of different media that I think are also helpful. So like creating a desire map, like in whatever way that feels good and works for, is that writing for you? Is that doing art for you? Is that folding paper in certain ways and kind of describing different experiences in the past for you? Is that really specific goals that you want to write down that you're going to achieve in the next year around kind of clarifying your desire? Or is it just, Sara had kind of some specific things that you wanted to accomplish, and I created a much more artistic interpretation with a wave and like words that I want to integrate into all of the sex and relationships that I have. And that was really important for me. There's also then my favorite, honestly, beyond the art stuff, because anything that gives me the chance to like make things and put glitter on them, I'm very excited about.
Very pro glitter.
Yeah. Very pro glitter. I loved the last activity, which was it was either like, there were 3 options. I don't remember what the other 2 were because I chose one of them, but it was write a personal ad for yourself was one of those options. And so it was a way to kind of distill down what I'd been trying to communicate to people, which then is what led to us connecting. It was like we just kind of like bumped into each other in this last activity, and Sara shared her piece. And
it was like femdom looking for cute, funny person to explore kink with, something like that.
And I was like, here's my personal ad.
It was like the flip of that. So we went to dinner, and I still didn't know we were gonna fuck, even though we talked about sex all the time at dinner.
And I was like, would you like to go on a date? Would you like to go to a dinner with me, and we can talk about it? And after she's like, oh, let me respond to your personal ad. And I was like, I was pretty clear on what was going on. And then until I think we actually got to my room, and we started stripping each other and doing a body scan. I think this is the point at which you're like, oh, sex is actually
the
happening.
sex thing. We're doing the sex thing. Oh, great.
It was great. It was just really well, and then it ended up. Then I'm a versatile switch, and then Sara went super fucking subby to me.
Yeah, that's true. That was
great.
exciting because I had only been dominant in a lot of in anything I had ever done before.
Like, that's fine. I can do that too. Whatever. It's all good.
It's really good.
Cool. Yeah, so highly recommend. Very exciting. And also, these are some of the things that you can do without going to the institute.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can start having these conversations and thinking through these things and talking to other people. We have some skills and some tools in the podcast that you can use to do some of this stuff.
The identifying desire episode and the sharing your desires. Yeah. Both of those are really informed by the Desire Mapping Institute. Also, if you search for Jamie, Jamie Grant, Desire Mapping, you'll find her website. And on her website, you can actually download a PDF. Yeah, exactly. You can actually download a PDF of the Desire Mapping workshop itself, and it walks you through every single step that you'd go through at creating change. So it's cool to go. It's great to be in a big room of sex positive people or people exploring sex, or like all that stuff is really great, and I highly recommend it if you can. But if you don't have the privilege, if you don't have the time, if you don't have the money, the access to be able to go to creating change, you can do this stuff online as well.
Yeah, and in the room itself, it's a limited space, right? So whoever is there at 9 a.m., those are the only folks that are going to be
get there early. Get there early
because the door closes at 9 a.m. and then only the folks that went to it in the first part of it can come back after lunch.
Mm-hmm. So which is to hold a safe container.
Yeah, you have this container for it, and there at the table that I was at. I was probably the most experienced person at the table that I was at, but there were, some folks.
Maybe like the facilitator person.
We didn't have a facilitator.
Oh, we ended up being the facilitators, kind of. Yeah.
I kind of facilitated my table. They did not have enough facilitators for the tables. But there was a person who had just turned 18 and was a freshman in college.
Oh, she was so great. I love talking to her. That was really
and then there were folks there was one person who was in his 50s who was at the table, and just kind of like figuring out where, we have this person who's kind of just trying to figure out what relationships look like, because the relationships that he was having when he was in high school were awful. And we had somebody who's like had exited a marriage and was trying to figure out what that looks like for them, and folks who were just trying to get into kink, and folks who had been in for a long time. So it's this really, really great space at kind of people coming from all different places to really be able to share.
Yeah, and it's really good broad questions that you can project yourself onto. So I think just for sex educators in general, that's a helpful tool to take away from this, is sometimes we want to get so specific, but actually it can be better to go really general.
Yeah. All right. A softball question, specifically written. Do you think sex phobia had an influence in the new laws like SESTA and FOSTA? How? Yes. So for those of the listeners who don't know, the SESTA and FOSTA, and I think the SESTA came out of the Senate and FOSTA came out of the House. Yes, thank you. I think it's the S is the Senate, but these are anti-sex trafficking, quote unquote, laws that are really just anti-sex work laws that have made sex work more dangerous for sex workers, and have also done things like drive payment off of certain platforms because they won't allow that to be there, because it could be trafficking. It's not trafficking.
Yeah.
Or close down Backpage, close down the Craigslist, including the misconnections, which is just sad because misconnections was fucking hilarious. But then also the T for T, the W for W, M for W, W for M for M sections of Craigslist, where a lot of sex workers would be able to find clients, screen clients better. And frankly, basically, when we look at any of these kind of like anti-sex trafficking pushes, and I think we talked some about this in the criminalization episode, they always just swing back to hit sex workers as hard as they possibly can, because sex trafficking itself is a thing that exists and has been blown up by anti-prostitution and anti-sex work non-governmental organizations around the world. And specifically, then they use this to target and end sex work.
Yeah. We
are never going to end sex work because we shouldn't, because fuck you if you want to. And two, it's work.
Yeah.
And also, I sure as hell am selling my goddamn body when I'm working at the University of Wisconsin in my day job. I'm selling my labor, my body, but this framing of what kind of labor is acceptable to sell under capitalism is fucking ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it just is so harmful. And so what I saw, for example, working in Milwaukee for a long time, is as the sex trafficking conversation spiked up, all the folks that were working the strolls, so all of the street level kind of sex workers who were on certain corners or on certain streets to pick up folks in cars, were driven inside. And as soon as they were driven inside, they didn't have pimps when they were outside. They didn't have anybody forcing them to do anything outside. Driven into cat houses, they're now locked down and can't get out. They can't screen clients. They don't have as much control. And they don't get to keep their money, and they don't get to leave. So we've now created trafficking by targeting trafficking.
Right.
And it's just completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I think another thing this makes me think of as well is actually the way that SESTA and FOSTA are written specifically requires sex phobia to work, right? Mm-hmm. Because they don't have enforcement mechanisms that are really specific. They don't really have, they don't assign any money to a task force to whatever. Like the way that they work is through fear and through basically what these laws do, and the reason that they're so dangerous is both of them say that social media platforms or places like YouTube, Facebook, Craigslist, like any platform online, they're immune from people. If somebody goes onto Facebook to do an illegal action, Facebook can't get sued for that action because they're the medium that somebody else is doing an illegal thing through. Does that make sense? And so what this does is it actually makes them liable for these things that are happening on their platforms, which they're obviously, because we live in a capitalist world that's really risk averse, it means these companies are going to do everything they can to lock down any potential thing that could potentially even possibly look like maybe sex work, right? And so you have all these websites that preemptively, you know, the Backpage thing happened before these even passed, right? The Craigslist taking down their things happened before this passed. Like Reddit taking down their personal ads like happened before this passed, right? And so it's very fear-based, and it's the fear of sex and sex work specifically being seen as inherently dangerous or risky, or that it's abusive just by existing or whatever else, right? And like, are there places where sex workers are treated poorly or abused? Yeah, of course there are, right? But why do we not talk about the abusive environment of working at a McDonald's? Like, why do we not talk about the abusive environment of how like nannies get treated? Like, why don't we, you know, like there's a lot of work that happens in this world that where there is violations of personal sovereignty and abuse and other things that happen. And so why do we single out sex work as this only venue that we're going to care about the impact of these things, but then say, well, yeah, you have no sick leave, so come in and work this food service job while you have a cold because you know what, right? Like, why is that not as dangerous, right? And it's because these laws are intended to protect capital and to protect large institutions from being seen as dangerous, risky proprietors, and all of that stems from this idea of sex as inherently dangerous or risky.
Yeah, and if we actually wanted to address the abuse and violence perpetuated against sex workers, then we decriminalize sex work.
Right, and you give them power over, yeah, you give sex workers power over controlling their own clientele, controlling their own environment, being able to use a bank for their money so they're not walking around with $1,000 in cash. Right, like yeah, like if you legalize those or if you decriminalize or legalize those environments, then that's really the way towards safety. It's not locking down and making people more afraid.
Yeah, or the Nordic model. Fuck the Nordic model.
No, not that kind of stuff.
Nordic model is you decriminalize selling sex, but criminalize buying sex, which then again just drives trafficking further underground and increases the likelihood that people are being forced to coerce and do sex work.
Right.
And hurts the people that are doing sex work that's not forced to coerce.
It sort of like comes off as looking more progressive because anything is more progressive than abolition, but like it doesn't really do anything to protect people.
Yeah, that's
yeah. So the last question that we have from the audience.
We have two more.
The third to last question that we have is what is your best counter argument for people who say demisexuals are just trying to make themselves seem special because they only have sex with people that they love? Also, Jay said that Z wouldn't read this, but how are you all so cute? So we'll take the second question first. We're
Am I bright red
cute.
now? Am I now bright red?
Yeah.
Do I now match my sweater?
You do.
Yeah.
We're very cute and adorable because we're the best, and it's great.
So what is my best counter argument? Fuck you. So there's a difference between the conversations that we have in community to talk about and share about and discuss identities and communicate ways in which people show up and feel good in themselves, and the trying to convince people that you're real because they've decided that you're not, and they've now put you on the offensive. And when it's that, fuck you, I'm not wasting my time on you.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I think another part of this too.
No. I have my favorite image now to post on arguments on Facebook or other media is just a spray bottle that says no. It's like, no.
We need a shirt that like on the front says Jay says talk about it and on the back says Jay says fuck.
No.
But yeah, I think for me, this gets to almost what we were talking about at the beginning about definitions of sex and about definitions of trans identities or other pieces too, where it's like, there's this way of wanting to destabilize other identities to prove that your own is more real or more right? And so to say like, well, demisexuals don't really exist because X, Y, or Z, or asexuals don't exist, or aromantic people don't exist, or all that kind of stuff.
Or we didn't have a word for it 20 years ago, so why do you need a special word
why do we need it now?
Because language changes, and that's awesome.
Yeah, and that's great. And so I think that my question in this case is, what's the person trying to get at, and what can you do by pushing back on them? Like, do you want this person to change? Do you want this person to grow and understand? Or like Jay said, are you able to kind of just be like, I don't need to explain myself to you, random Facebook commenter. So if you're really invested in somebody, then I would say, go to the personal. That's what I always try to do. If you're, I assume a demi person wrote this because this is what it seems like, but go to the personal. Say like, you know what, actually, I can understand how you would think that because it's something that's in our culture a lot, but actually demisexuality for me doesn't mean that I'm trying to make myself seem special. It just means that my sexuality is really dependent on how I'm feeling about somebody and where I'm feeling personally. And would some people just call that sexual in a different way and not need to call it demisexual? Like, yeah, of course, some people would. But I like that term because it makes me feel more at home and aware and understanding of myself and my body. And so just like how other people don't have to use that term if it doesn't work for them, I should be able to use it if it does help me too, right? So identity terms shouldn't be like something that is entrapping you or that makes you feel like you're limited. If you like identity terms because they're additive to you, then use them. But also you don't have to feel like just because there isn't some official thing to call you, it doesn't mean that it's less right or less real.
And you get to create whatever words you want to. And I think that's one of the things that so, you go and you do a presentation for healthcare providers or whatever, and they always start with terminology. And mine basically just starts with, there's so many new words, it's really cool, and you're never gonna know what they all mean. And isn't that amazing? I learn new ones every day. Here's some basic stuff, but like, it's so cool. And we should be able to approach each other with that openness and that kindness and that responsiveness to be able to go, these are the words that I use that feel great for me. Those are the words that you use that feel great for you. Let's have a conversation about it. And I will also say that although my immediate impulse is fuck you, because I don't got time for that usually, that I really am also trying to, particularly within community, not treat people as disposable. It's hard as fuck. It is a growing and learning edge for me. And so trying to push into, okay, you're saying well, you don't think that genderqueer people can possibly exist. My genderqueer ass is like, oh, fucking hell.
Oh no, I'm invisible.
I'm not here. But to be able to go, okay, so when you're saying this is what I'm hearing and feeling, tell me what you mean. And if it is just, well, I don't think that you're real, well then, we're not gonna have a relationship. And be able to go, what you're saying is gross, and I hope that you're able to come back into community in a way that's actually affirming for people. And I'm not gonna invest my time right now in trying to change you. There are resources that you can look at, and I hope that you're gonna be able to move beyond this. But I'm not gonna invest my energy in fixing you or arguing with you when we're starting from a place of you not even being willing to accept that I exist as a person. Right?
Yeah.
There's a difference between, well, it doesn't exist because, but gender dysphoria says this, and this is how I've always felt. That's a much different entry point. And then we can have a conversation, you as a binary trans man, for example, and me as a genderqueer person can have a conversation about, yeah, and that's been erasive and that's been harmful. This is what happens in community. And don't we want to be able to just be here and support each other? And that doesn't mean that I'm going to say gender is false and men are evil. Sometimes. Generally speaking, I do not believe that about all men. But I will say that, like, and we need to talk about the misogyny that's showing up in the ways that you're presenting yourself. And also, we need to talk about the misogyny that I'm maybe not seeing in the ways that I'm doing in the world. And so we can do that for each other. But again, we have to find that entry point. And if folks are not even at a place, then it's okay to say, I'm not throwing you away, but I'm protecting myself and not investing in a relationship that you are not willing to invest in either.
I try to use a 2-comment rule for online stuff. So it's like,
I was talking more in person. Online, it's like, this is worthless.
If it's a space that I enjoy or somewhere that I want to keep being or something, and I have the energy or whatever, I use the 2-comment rule where originally I'll engage and say it sounds like you're saying this, but actually how that comes across to me is X, Y, or Z. Nice. And then you let the person either go further down their own rabbit hole or reflect and be like, oh, wow, I didn't think about it that way or whatever, right? And then if they go way further down and start going into anger, defensiveness, whatever, then I'll make one more comment that's like, it seems like you're really upset about this. That's not where I'm trying to come from. I hope that you can come back to this and learn from it later. Here's some articles, here's some resources, and then I'm done. Drop that mic, I'm out. I don't need to have a screaming match back and forth on Facebook. It's just not productive for me anymore.
Well, and I will say that I also make a distinction between the identities in which I hold power and the identities in which I am targeted.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to engage with a person who is throwing cis sexism everywhere and erasing trans people as real. That's not going to be worth it. But I am going to deal with this other white person about their racism. I am going to deal with this other person about their educational credentialism. I am going to deal with this other person about their anti-sex worker feelings and oppression and bias, because those are the places that I need to do this, because I have power in those identities and groupness. But in the places that I'm targeted, I'm not wasting my time on queers are evil. I'm like, okay. Yes, we are all Catholic.
You caught me.
And
Uh-oh.
I'm gonna go home to my black
You're
cat,
my
which I
porn.
literally have. And here I go. Yes, evil. Woo! No, but whiteness, I have to engage around until or unless that person blocks me in. This.
I was just looking at time because we're at an hour.
I know.
This is also very real to how we record the show.
All right. So next one. I'm new to the polyamory world, and I've met a person, let's call Jay. We're the initial J.
Not this J.
Not this J. I would not be putting her down. We're interested in each other, and I think that they are also dating or involved with another one of my friends. I'm feeling a little unsure about how this could affect me and Jay, as well as Jay and my friend's dynamic and my relationship with my friend. I think I need to ask about this, and I don't know how. There's like a triangle going on here. So how do I ask about whether they're dating and respect everyone's dynamic and not just make it about my own curiosity?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and something that comes up in polyamory a lot, right? Because I think we come from this place of wanting to have full awareness of everything all the time that's going on. And for me in polyamory, I've had to let that go. I've had to be when you go on a date with somebody else, I don't need to know every time you and Crash are on a date. All right, I'm sorry. I don't need to
They're
know.
okay with that, it's fine.
I don't need to know every time you and your nesting partner are on a date. It's
my
great.
nesting partner's name is Crash. Literally just connect those dots. All right, moving on.
We're there. I'm sorry.
They've said it to me.
Okay. But I don't need to know that. I'm glad that that's there. I'm glad that you have that love and that support in your life. But I also don't need to hold that. For this case, though, it's a little different because it's already a friend group that's together, right? And so it's not that there's something wrong with wanting to know, but I think that approaching it is important to saying something more like, I'm interested in hearing more about our relationship and our dynamic and what you feel that structure is for you. And then what do your other relationships look like? Or what does your other relationship structure look like, right? Especially when you're early on in a relationship. Polyamory, like we mentioned before, is so individual and so self-defined that somebody might think of polyamory as being married and living with somebody and having sex with other people on the side. Someone might think of it as living with 4 people and all raising a kid together. Some people might think of it as being solo and really just being by yourself a lot and having sex with partners individually every now and then. Some people might think polyamory is like having group sex all the time. Like there are different ways that people experience. That would be amazing.
That would be spectacular.
Would love that. Group sex is great, but the scheduling it is really complicated.
It's what Google Calendar is for.
But sort of one conversation that I really like having with people is like, what does your polyamory mean to you? What does that structure look like for you? What are your other relationships like, right? And not from a prying place of like, I need to know what type of sex like Jay and other partners have, or like not from that place, but from the place of like, how do I fit into this structure for you? And what does this look like? Yeah,
and it's good to do kind of that internal check, right? Like, where is this coming from? Is this coming from jealousy? Is this coming from insecurity? Is this coming from fear? If it's coming from those places, what do I actually need to know or do about it? If it's coming from, I want to make sure that I'm being thoughtful about potential conflict that could come up. I want to be thoughtful about what your definitions are and what mine are and what this could look like. I want to make sure that if you are in a relationship with this other person, that I'm really clear about what my boundaries are, about what you share with them about our relationship and what you share with me about your relationship. Coming from those places is really good and really important. And the way that I like now to ask about this, thank you, Esper Bergman, for this framing in your newest book, is what is your constellation of relationships or intimates? And that also gives freedom to talk about not just like sex, not just love, like not just the kind of relationships that we define as romantic love, but also those friendships, those chosen family relationships that you have, those super supportive partners that you have. And honestly, like, differentiating between friends and partners for me is very complicated because how the hell do you do that? Again, about, everybody's consenting to what the label is and all of these things. But, the things that I'm going to do with a friend or a chosen family member are maybe very similar to what I do with a partner. So being able to then talk about those other people that are in my life that are super important that maybe I've co-parented with in the past, maybe are the person that I know that I can go to about a certain kind of trauma and working something through, someone that I know that I can go to and get support unconditionally about what I'm dealing with at work stuff. And those are still in my constellation of intimates, but they're not my polyamorous partners. Yeah. Anything else you want to say?
No, I just think that when it comes to this stuff, it's important to know what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And if the person that you're with has some sort of really negative reaction to that conversation, that's a thing to explore further and to be like, where is that coming from? And why is it scary for you to share? Are you coming from a lot of really monogamous relationships where you were cheating and you're used to hiding the relationships that you're in? And so now being really open about them is really hard, right? Or you feel like you're going to drive people away if you tell them about you're having fun with another person or, whatever else. And so this can be the start of a conversation, even if somebody takes it poorly. That can be a place to grow from as well.
Yeah.
But really look into where's that coming from if there's a sort of negative reaction to it as well.
Yeah. So we have one more question. So while we're answering this one, just to do a quick, does anyone have any other questions? Please hand them up to the front and we will talk about them.
Okay.
And please feel free to do that while we were answering. Otherwise, this will be our last question tonight.
Yeah, I'm going to do paper noises for Foley sound effects. It's an audio drama.
You can't see us up here.
Well, that's true. Okay, last question. Until recently, I have really identified with and enjoyed being a sub in almost all of my sexual dynamics, meaning submissive. Partially thanks to this wonderful podcast. Aw, yay. I've been doing a lot of desire mapping and finding that I'm very interested in doming several activities, but I'm feeling held back from starting to explore these desires due to a major lack of confidence, or as I like to say, domfidence.
Have you literally ever said that before?
Yes, I have. Nikki is.
It's never been said on Sorry, Nikki.
There was one time where Nikki made some sort of joke about my domers. I was like, "You're killing my domfidence." What do you?
Oh, the awful honey.
I love you a lot. Anyway, sorry. It feels like being a dom requires you to really know what you're doing. So my question is, how do you build confidence as a dom while you're just in the exploration stage? This is an amazing question.
So good.
This is a really good one.
Yeah.
Is there something that you want to start with on that, or do you want me to just kind of go?
I mean, why don't you go ahead.
Okay.
I'm very excited about this. I will just say, fake it till you make it.
Yeah,
Works
that's part of it.
exceptionally well. And that is honestly the only way that I've ever projected confidence until I actually felt it. Because like you can read all the things, you can go to all the classes, you can figure out, and you have the skills, and you're just like, just fake it. I know what I'm doing. We're gonna negotiate this shit, and then I am gonna call you a slut because that is what you want me to call you, and I'm gonna drop my voice a little bit. It's gonna be great.
Yeah, yeah. Some of it is that sort of fake it till you make it piece. I think some of it is having safeguards in place, right? And so, like, if you listen to the safe words episode that we just did, one of the things that I talked about in that episode was sort of how safe words helped me as a dom really step into trusting myself and also trusting my submissives, because that sort of feeling of like you have to be good at everything to be a dom, I think is kind of a misnomer. You certainly have to have physical skill if you're doing something like whipping or spanking or like things that are going to involve potential harm. But to actually do the act of dominance, it's not supposed to be. I might want to say this. I think there's this idea that subbing is just like laying down and being like, okay, dom me. and
anyone who's subbed for anything knows this, right? Like
right.
You're an active participant in this shit, and if you're not, I'm not interested.
I mean, if you want to do a pillow princess scene, it's good.
If you want to do a pillow princess scene, great. If that is what we're doing without negotiating it, this is not going to work.
Exactly, right? And a lot of that comes from sexism, right? It comes from the idea of like male dominance and men being able to control everything about sex, and that men are supposed to be the ones in charge, and supposed to know everything about sex, and they're supposed to make sure that everyone is having the type of sex that's good, whatever. And certainly as a dom, that's your goal, is to maintain that. But it should be a collaborative project. It shouldn't just be you have to come up with everything. Right. You have to, and if you're with partners who are making you do that labor, maybe talk to them about that and say like, you know, I want this to feel collaborative. I want to feel like we're building this together. And I just feel like it's me putting together a lot of stuff and you saying like, okay, I guess, right? That's really different. Yeah. The other thing for doming too is watching, like just like go to kink.com and watch some like porn with doms in it, or go to a dungeon or go to a class. Yeah, if you have the money, pay a dominatrix, like to not even to just like dom you necessarily, but just to even come spend time with you and talk to you about like, how do you do this? What do you think about when you're doing this? Can you show me some skills that you do? Like there are people you can negotiate that with, to make that work. And really, the other thing as well is start small, right? So you don't have to start by like giving someone 100 lashes with a whip, right? You can start by like doing a cuddling scene where every now and then you kind of like pull their hair back a little bit, right? Or where you can sort of do things where like you're leaving hickeys on someone's chest, or do little things where there isn't a lot of physical risk, like with like there is with slapping or hitting or punching or something, and use that to kind of build up your confidence too. Because the more that you do that kind of stuff, then the more you'll feel like, okay, now I can start to explore this and really step into this identity.
And also, there's not one right way to dom, right? Mm-hmm. So my style tends to be pretty teasing. Mm-hmm. Depending on, you know, if folks want to be humiliated, then we'll go further into that. And that actually has been an edge for me, because humiliation play that's just hard for me to do. And so that's been one of those places where it's just like, okay, I know you want this, because when I am subbing this, I know I want this. And so I'm going to do this, and I'm going to fake the fuck out of it, because I know you want me to do this, and then I'm going to kind of figure out my style from here. But like also knowing where your edges are and knowing that you can red or yellow out as a dom is also super important. That's important. But you know, so the style of kind of femdoming that Sara does, which you talk a lot about in the domination episode, is very different than like the power dom, I do all the things, and I hope communicate. I hope you communicate. Please check in. Please check in. Please at least have negotiated check-ins in some way. That is kind of what is often projected into like kink doming, or even just, you know, topping for sex doesn't have to also involve dom, right? So you can be a dom and a top in something, but you can also be a dom and a bottom in something. You can be a top and a sub in something.
One of my favorite things is doming people to sit on my face. So like, I really like having my face sat on, and I also like doming, and so like, but I'm bottoming for the activity, but I'm doming to tell the person to do the thing, right? And so like you can play with that in those ways. Yeah. And the other thing this is something you talk about, Jake, but coming from the sub side, you know that subs want it, right? Yeah. You know that like subs want to be spanked or throat fucked or choked or have their hair pulled or do whatever thing people are into. Get fisted, like get peed on, like get whatever. Like you know that you want that when you're a sub, and so it can help you be like, and when I'm a dom, I trust that the people who are negotiating with me authentically want that too. Mm-hmm. And so that for me, coming from the doming side and not subbing very much, was really hard of being like, well, yeah, I know I want to throat fuck people, but like, I don't know anybody who wants to get that. And so is it? Hands
are going up.
My two humans. But sort of like, being able to trust that like somebody wants to receive this as much as I want to give it, is a really important thing too. Because I think our world, we see it as like, oh, I guess you like feet. Well, oh, I hate feet, but I'll just do the feet thing, I guess, because you really want it, right? Like that's not the type of kink and sex that I want to be having. I want to have things where our Venn diagrams overlap. I want to do this, you want to do it too, and let's find a way to make it work.
And you're gonna miss.
Yeah.
And that's okay. And you're going to, in my experience,
perfectionism is rough.
Fall out of the bed and just have it end in hysterics. Or, as happened recently with my nesting partner, give them an orgasm and they pass out while they're telling you on the side of the bed, and then go, oh, and just like laugh hysterically for 20 minutes after making sure everyone is okay and nobody's head got hurt, and then go back into it, right? And it's okay to like take the space to make it funny, take the space to make a miss. And if you make a miss and you don't want to go into the funny round, go into talking about how that was teasing them, right? You missed and you hit the bed. Don't you wish that I'd hit you instead? What are you gonna do for me so that I hit you?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Like just flip it, just go with it. It's great. And just be really open about it and make sure that you give space for the hilarity that's gonna happen, because perfectionism doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And whiteness teaches us that it should.
Right.
And it's bullshit. Right.
Yeah. It's okay as a dom to make mistakes. It's okay to hit too hard or not hit hard enough. It's okay to not be sure what you're doing. Like all of these things are okay. And you should be playing with people who want to go to that place of learning with you, especially early on. And so, just like, the advice that I give to people who are like, I'm 26 and I'm a virgin and I don't have sex, I'm like, tell people you're a virgin, and then go find people who want to like help move you through that experience, right? Yeah. Instead of the sort of thing of like, how do I hide this thing so that people don't know how inexperienced I am? Just be upfront with it, and you'll find other people who are open to exploring that. Just, I will say, be careful in community. Sometimes there are people who are well experienced and usually have like age and financial privilege who are wanting to exploit people who are looking for those learning type dynamics for manipulating and not really keeping things consensual. So just be aware of that in community spaces, sometimes around kink or on FetLife or on whatever else. But
and it's totally okay, like as a dom who's learning new skills, even if you've been doming mostly for a long time, or you're just getting into it, to say, I'm just exploring this and I'd love to explore this with you. How do you feel about that? Yeah. And go from there.
That was one of the ways I found some of my favorite fuck buddies. Yep. Was just like posting on Facebook like, hey, I'm looking to practice my rope skills, like who wants to come over? And like, we don't have to be partners forever, like just who wants to come over and practice this with me?
You found lots of great rope bottoms that way.
I did, yeah. I found lots of them. It was really great.
Yes. So thank you.
I think that's what we have. Thank you. This was really great.
I love you.
And I'm so glad we did this. And thank you again to the Ace&Aro Club.
Hey, Ace&Aro Club at CU Boulder.
And thank you so much for bringing us in. If anyone else is interested in bringing us in, Jay and I are looking for places to go in the spring and next fall. So if you're somewhere, if you're a community center, if you're LGBT center, people can pool their money together to fly us in, bring us in, whatever. We'll do live episodes, we'll do workshops, everything. So we'd love to do this more. And thank you so much for giving us our first chance to do a live episode. Yay! Thank you. We did it! Yay!
We can stick around for a little while if folks wanna